All right. Welcome back to RevOps Review, a news podcast on all things RevOps. And I am joined today by Docusign pricing leaders, Jan and Maggie. And I'm just going to take a minute and let them introduce themselves. But basically, this podcast, we're going to go through what you could be thinking about in terms of pricing in general and best practices there, also in the market right now, and just areas of expertise that they can share and trends they're seeing. So Jan, can you give a little bit of background about yourself?
Sure. Great to be here. Thank you, Kate. I have built my career out of creating pricing strategies and creating pricing organizations in companies that maybe didn't have a dedicated pricing team before. So I've done it a few times over at Microsoft, LinkedIn, Citrix, LogMeIn, Zoom, and then now at Docusign, I'm leading the pricing and offering strategy. So I'm pretty passionate about setting up the good practices and good strategy, but also I have quite a lot of experience in the operational side of things. So how to make it happen in practice. So I can talk broadly about not only what the philosophy of pricing is, but how it can be implemented.
And yes, hi, I'm Maggie Bouscaren. I'm on Jan's team at Docusign. I'm a director of pricing strategy, working closely with product management, marketing, sales, among other teams, to help bring unique value to customers via our products. My past experience has been grounded in thinking about different business and growth models across tech, e-commerce, and financial services.
Awesome. Well, kicking off, I just want to start with like a fundamental question, which is, when you're thinking about pricing, both of you working in concert, what objectives do you set out to help guide the pricing process? Like, is it market share, revenue, segmentation, reach into competitive spaces? Like, what are some key sort of bolder focus items that you have that help you navigate as you're thinking about pricing? And this is for, we talk to startups big and small. We also talk to enterprise and mid-market. And I know it's probably different for each, but what are some core fundamentals that you like to think about or advise CEOs and execs to think about as they're looking at pricing?
I think that I'll let Maggie jump in because I know that she feels strongly about those, but I think the first thing that is often skipped, and that's being aligned to the company objectives. And I think that everybody has in the organization has sometimes a different view of what the company objective is, because for a product team, it's going to be more of a adoption of the new functionality or a new product. They are their KPIs, their OKRs, their goals are about spreading broadly of what they just built. For the CFO, then it's going to be probably margins. For the head of sales, it's a top line growth and hitting the next quarter's number. So I always joke that 80% of my job as the head of pricing is aligning the executives on what we are actually trying to solve, because it's not obvious that it's revenue. And let me give you some examples from the companies that I worked at. For instance, Zoom was still is in this broad expansion phase. And in this phase for this company, the margins are not necessarily the most important. It is the reach and the number of customers, because the idea and the strategy is that we get them in the door through video conferencing, and then we're going to apply and upsell other services and products. Whereas even in the same category in video conferencing, when I worked for Citrix on GoToMeeting, because of the place where the organization was in, because of the market at the time, the focus was on margins. So it's that I want to emphasize that we need to drive a kind of executive level alignment of what we are trying to solve. Margins, direct revenue, reach, churn mitigation. There are multiple elements that we can solve for. Unfortunately, usually we cannot solve for all of them at the same time.
Yeah. Is there a prioritization that you think about at all? Like, Maggie, do you have a comment on that? Or just when you're looking at not solving for everything all at once, like, where do you maybe start?
Right. Yeah. I think to build off of what Jan was saying, I think an important part of pricing and packaging is to align with, I always start the initial kind of business case conversation with the product managers I'm working with as they're like innovating and building out their roadmap. Okay, what is the role of this product also in our portfolio? Because every product or feature even within the portfolio can play a different role. And so I think, Kate, one thing to also consider is if we're going to drive reach, for example, the product has to be very intuitive. Right. So because it needs to be more self-service, even kind of founded on product-led growth, versus something that we think, is super unique from the competition, and we're planning on using it to drive direct revenue and charge for it. That may be something that maybe is more complex and requires services on onboarding, but that's okay because there's enough customer value and willingness to pay in that offering. So I think you also have to consider where the product can best play, and then align the pricing and packaging both for the business objective, but also within the portfolio set. And then another comment is consideration for both the product life cycle and the maturity of the market. So if this is a new product and we realize we're just releasing MVP functionality, it may be super important to drive adoption, and therefore we'll be willing to forego some of the pricing and kind of offer a deeper discount in order to get into the hands of more people and prove out kind of proof of value and use those customer win stories to then gain more monetization and more revenue later on. Similarly, in a mature market versus a kind of more nascent market, earlier adopters, you'd think about pricing and packaging differently depending on how saturated the market is and how familiar customers are with the product and the value it can provide.
Yeah. On that topic, go ahead. Yeah.
To add to your point, Maggie, I think that the aligning on the goals that I mentioned, I think you're highlighting an important point that those goals can be very different product by product. And so even if we are aligned on the kind of maybe corporate strategy level where the company is going, there can be deviations when we zoom into particular product lines or offerings. So that's also important to consider.
It's so funny. In my experience, having worked at kind of hyper growth startups that are not at the maturity that Docusign is at, oftentimes pricing sits in a spreadsheet. And then there's this kind of generalized little bit of an argument about what do we do, what do we not do? And there's potentially fear of changing what's working and optimizing it for fear of maybe, losing revenue because you tried to make a creative change. And so I think that's what everybody's thinking about right now with the market being a little bit funky, is how do you explore adjusting your pricing without doing long-term damage to your ARR when the market's being sensitive? And how do you kind of just gain consensus around that and trial test things out successfully? One of a CEO I was talking to last week was just saying, there's increased competition, there's compressed pricing, and how do I identify, maybe can I pick verticals to target to discount that might expand later so I can recoup the loss? Is there a better way to lower pricing without compressing, NRR, ARR, and making it look like the ARR numbers are lowering? How can companies sort of start thinking about alternatives and experimentation? And so curious what your thoughts there are, Jan, in terms of that process for companies that are kind of scrambling right now.
You want to start, Maggie? I've got some thoughts.
Sure. I can start sort of high level, and then I think Jan has some more kind of tactical examples. I think, Kate, to your point, when a market has changed suddenly and maybe significantly, it's important not to lose the foundation of customer value and aligning your pricing to customer value. And so understanding, look, if the value of your product has changed with this new market, are there things you can do so that you bring it back to kind of its original state? For example, exploring new use cases or different ways to use your product that customers aren't previously taking advantage of that might increase its value. Or if you know that certain features or use cases drive stickiness and are then less likely to result in churn, partial churn, or customers leaving you, can you proactively go in, and this is not a pricing mechanism, but more of a kind of a cross-team mechanism, go in and invest in driving adoption. And so then I think that's just kind of high level, but then there are certain pricing strategies you can do in more of a scoped way that doesn't cause long-term damage, like you mentioned. And so, Jan, I'll let you go into some of those.
Yeah, I would love to hear like tangible examples maybe you've seen from a past life or current life of this as well. I mean, just how this actually operationalizes out.
So I think there are two questions within your question. I think one is maybe more broad, which is how to change a pricing model or the rates. So whether we're going up or down or changing how we are going to charge our customers. It is always scary. It is there is significant revenue risk with revolutionizing things in the SaaS organization where we are charging subscriptions, so that there is this big volume of existing customers that can demand their prices to be adjusted if we lower price for the new customers. So overall, how I see the kind of relatively risk-free management of changing a pricing model is in 3 steps. One, we model it based on data, and I think we're going to go into the methods of research later on. So maybe I'll just stop at that. So modeling using some statistical tools, then running a test, preferably a A/B test. Online tests are relatively easy to execute. Some tests with sales reps are also possible. And then finally, staged rollout. So by segment, by country, depending how we want to kind of expand the introduction of the new model. So that way, we are kind of triple checking, highlighting any risks in that process and adjusting the model, because I've never had a situation where the initial idea and the initial pricing strategy that we designed, even with a lot of research and homework done, I've never had a situation when it would be implemented exactly the same way in the end. There is always some adjustment because we learn as we go. So that's kind of the answer to the question of how to change a pricing model in practice. But then I think that what you touched upon is, in particular, how we lower prices in the light of the current markets where the willingness to pay might be decreasing, where budgets might be cut. So I think that one thing that should definitely not be done is taking the same product, the same packaging, the same offering, and just slashing the price across. So that is the most risky way of lowering the prices. That is the way that could really affect the existing customers' revenue. So there are a few tricks or methods to make sure that the new customers that are the prospects have access to some lower pricing options. However, we don't disturb the existing customer base, and that would be running lower pricing as a promotion. So communicating that it's a special circumstances, right?
Can I pause for a sec? Because I want to clarify something. So you're suggesting here that focus on the new customers for the lowered pricing, but don't mess with renewals or the midterm changes with existing customers. Is that more or less accurate?
Yes, I think that predominantly we should focus on new customers and making sure that pipeline of new business is still flowing, even though the market now demands lower rates. But let me talk about what we do for new customers, and then I'll touch upon how we can manage the existing ones. So for new customers, so promos, kind of repackaging, maybe providing a new flavor of a product, new offering that is low cost, like airlines come up with a kind of economy basic option, right? So still, what you used to buy, the standard economy, still stays the same, and many customers still buy it. And then there's a new option for the very price sensitive crowd, and we might realize that it's only a certain subset of our customers that is very price sensitive, and we can continue as business as usual with the ones that are maybe fully realize the value of the product and they are not necessarily that price sensitive. So forms of repackaging, promotions, and investing in communicating the value to the customer, obviously. So that's on the new customers. On the existing ones, overall, in my experience, the existing customers are very kind of mixed cohorts. So it's very often what I've seen is that many of them who's been using the product for a while, they realize a lot of value through it, and they are not at high risk of churning. They maybe integrated the product with their processes and internal tools, and they don't really demand discounts. It's so segmenting the existing customer base and really identifying what are the cohorts that are maybe underutilizing the product, who's been sold at the higher rate, who are at the risk of churn, doing actually some statistical analysis on what is the correlation between some attributes of existing customers and their probability to churn is crucial. Well, like one thing that we cannot do is to look at the body of existing customers as a one big mass and assume that they will behave the same way. So once we segment it and we identify the particularly risky customers who are at a high risk of churn, that's when some proactive add-ons, value adds, some even proactive rate discounts would be the right solution to balance the overall impact to the MRR and ARR with limiting the risk of churn.
Yeah. So it sounds like, for companies that don't have an add-on strategy right now, they really should start thinking about segmenting bundles or different basic, better, best options with add-ons to give themselves some flexibility. So the people that have probably preemptively had this structure in place have probably more flexibility right now to play compared to companies that maybe have more vanilla pricing. Would that be an accurate assessment?
By vanilla pricing, you mean maybe kind of one size fits all, this is the product? Absolutely. So this is why we have the whole good, better, best structure that is the most widely adopted, because it allows for differentiation of the price point depending on the customer situation and their needs and willingness to pay. So in the situation when we need to provide lower price option, it offers a relatively easy way of maybe shifting some features around, some key pricing drivers around, adjusting the rate, still maintaining the good, better, best overall structure of the lineup, but more suited to the new market reality.
Totally makes sense. What I'm curious about is there's lots of different options, the new bundle structure of like an even more basic bundle, which I really love that idea, but, short-term promos, freemium, adding free trials, repackaging that, other things, and to maybe monetize parts of a platform that weren't monetized before. Out of those sort of options, are there any that kind of strike you as a good go-to to start, or do you just have to play with them all?
Free trials and freemium are not really the tools for fighting the kind of market's commoditization or fighting the increased price pressure. Because free trial and freemium offering, the main goal of that pricing tool, pricing arrangement, is to make sure that customers have the ability to get acquainted with the product before they enter the credit card details or send the check. And I think that it's a good practice for many products that can be kind of self-implemented, so they are the customer can kind of play with them and realize how they can be useful and how they provide value. And if the solution that you're offering kind of falls into that category, so it can be just provisioned and the customer would learn and start appreciating it, then it could be done in any markets, and it should be done in any market. So that's where this is not necessarily the right tool for fighting kind of more difficult market conditions, but this is more of a general tool used in any market to drive the top line, like top of the funnel for the purchasing funnel. So that's where I wouldn't put it in the same category as like a rate promotions or rebundling with the lower price point. It's a slightly different type of a tool.
Yeah. One random question I have is, spinning up self-service on your website to lower the cost of acquisition. This is less about pricing, but more of the sales cost. How much do you think that should be a priority on companies' minds is really a website self-service motion? Sometimes those can be a little bit higher churn because they're going to be a lower price point, or in-app self-service. How much of that are you seeing in the market as a focus right now in a trend?
I think PLG is a huge trend right now, and defining what that means for your company is important because it can mean different things for different people and different companies. And so while I think it is always top of mind to lower acquisition costs, it's also important to understand what's required to be successful to convert customers. And if that is a salesperson walking through the value prop, sharing a demo, a solution engineer, or even services kind of onboarding the company you're selling into, that's not really going to fit into a self-service model. And so understanding where it makes sense to be self-service and for customers to buy via credit card and driving widespread adoption for those products that are intuitive, are kind of fit in a self-service model, great. But it's not that one size fits all. Like, there are certain products, even at Docusign, that without sort of a walkthrough and sort of aligning to a business's objectives of how it can help solve their needs, it's not going to do well in a self-service model. And so it's important that we are investing in a direct sales motion there.
That totally makes sense. And it's interesting, having a pricing call that's generalized is kind of hard because pricing such a special snowflake to whatever your offering is and who your buyer is. And it's so very, very curated, which is so interesting about, I think, pricing, and the many options are almost overwhelming about it. I'm going to double click into usage because this is another hot one besides PLG. And I think it's close to Jan's heart from what I know of him. And so I'm going to go there and just say, ask the question of just like, is it a helpful or a hurtful thing in, a market that's a little wobbly? And, how are you seeing them get adopted right now? What are some tangible examples? I know that there's multiple pricing models. We news supports 3, credit burn down, usage overage, pay as you go. Would love to double click in whatever order you want into just usage and what you feel about it.
But before we go into the usage, do you mind if I comment on what Maggie just mentioned about the product-led growth?
Yeah.
I think that we have seen in the past few years this focus on top-level growth. So, the total revenue growth, that's how companies are usually assessed by Wall Street. So kind of the speed and dynamic of revenue growth was the main goal. Back talking to, what is the right pricing model? The right pricing model is the one that gets you to your corporate goals. And putting more sales reps in the seats, and even if they need to do very transactional type of sales, was the best way to grow sales very quickly, because we didn't have to adjust the product itself, the billing or the pricing model for product-led growth. I want to highlight that how things are sold through a sales rep versus how they are sold using the product-led growth self-serve methodology, that definitely requires different pricing models. So because the sales rep is able to explain a more complicated either pricing or explain more complex bundle that is impossible to easily explain online as a customer plays with a product. So that the reason why we haven't had kind of the PLG before, and it's kind of being the theme of this quarter in SaaS industry now, is because the corporate goals have changed. Everybody is now focusing on margins and less on the super fast top line growth, and kind of removing some of the stuff from transactional type of sales is the priority right now, which wasn't before. And I feel very strongly personally about the product-led growth, because I started studying software engineering to make sure that people are not doing jobs that machines can do for them. So I think that in some cases, if it's a very transactional kind of order taking type of a sales job, it becomes something that could be done by a complex but still a system. So that's where I would love to see people being freed from that kind of roles and the systems take over. But sorry, back to your question about the usage-based model. I'm assuming you're asking about the kind of the pay-as-you-go and consumption.
Yeah, I think that there's 3 fairly dominant models. You have the credit burn down model, which is much more predictable, and in terms of ARR, usage overage, which has a lot of benefit as well, and then pay-as-you-go. And I'm just curious, as people are exploring options, what we see is that all pricing is a snowflake, and it's hybrid. So you could have a subscription piece, a usage piece, a one-time piece, and then whether it's services, physical goods, subscription, usage, and it's all blended together, which is really interesting. But, where does usage fit? Where does usage fit right now? How can CEOs and execs think about it in terms of their pricing?
It all depends on who you are selling to and what you're selling and what your cost structure is. The usage-based model, whether it is based on credits or some overages, or it's truly pay-as-you-go, in a way they are flavors of the same philosophy, but executed a bit differently. But when it comes to that philosophy of being charging per consumption of the product, the main disadvantage of that is that it penalizes adoption. So customer is, kind of charged per each incremental unit they use, and that's the way they will probably not kind of spread the usage of the tool across the whole organization. So that's a significant disadvantage for the long term. In the short term, it is hard to budget and predict revenue, which is a significant obstacle operationally, both for the customers and the service providers. The pro is that in a situation when the product has very high cost, so let's think providing some telecommunication services that are, the cost is charged by the hour, providing some services that require manual work, like consultancy or some like training services, or like airlines where the cost of fuel is a significant part of the ticket. In those cases, then per unit pricing really makes sense, and then the management of margins is easy. So kind of subscription model would not work for many of them, even though we do see that Alaska and Frontier introduced all-you-can-fly pricing models, right? So I believe that pay-as-you-go has very limited or any form of consumption model, very limited usage when it's high COGS, and the value is really very strongly correlated with how much the customer uses, not just kind of having the access to the tool whenever needed. Maggie, do you have some more thoughts?
I was gonna add too, since we were talking about new customers or sort of strategies in a down market too, layering adoption accelerators into a consumption-based model. So a framework can be for a new customer or for a customer where it's really challenging to forecast how much they're going to use. An adoption accelerator allows them to go over, let's say, 125% of their purchase amount with no overage fees. Mm-hmm. And that gives them the flexibility to figure out what they will actually use in a more realistic way for their next renewal. But you give them that flexibility without making your business vulnerable to extreme abuse, sort of overage, beyond what would be something you could suffice from a margin standpoint. But that adoption accelerator has been very helpful for new customers joining Docusign, where they're not thinking about usage so clearly yet. And so we kind of help them get to a point where it's more easy to forecast.
It's almost like a promotion on overage a little bit for is it a time delimited thing, or is it, for this period of this year, or, I'm just curious how you think about it.
Yeah, so typically the adoption accelerator will be the length of the contract term. And so in some ways it can be beneficial to incentivize longer contracts too, right? So if you kind of get that beneficial pricing for the 3 years, it's better than just the 1 year. So length of the contract term, and then we'll reassess. I'll also say for overages, there's sort of two models, and you want to avoid any customer being on an overage for the majority of the time, or for majority of your customers being on an overage model. But you can think about automatic collection of overages, where as soon as they've hit above their purchase amount, you start collecting automatically, or letting them consume. There's no cap on adoption or no automatic charge, and then you apply a true-up model at renewal. And so when Jan mentioned it can be really a hindrance to adoption, having some flexibility there where it's not so burdensome from a price point and give customers the confidence to adopt.
Yeah, I think there's a customer experience question too, and all kind of laced through all of this. Yeah, Jan, you were about to say something.
Because I think that Maggie touched upon a very important point about kind of different budgeting and forecasting and prediction preferences from customers. And what I cannot emphasize enough is that the preferences for a smaller customer, SMB, predominantly transacting online, are drastically different than the preferences and requirements for an enterprise customer. Because for a smaller customer, if we present them with some consumption-based plan where they need to assess how much of those units, whether it's minutes or envelopes for Docusign or some credits, how much does my organization need per month, they are not always able to do it straight away. And because they are on the website, they cannot assess how much they need. They think, well, I'll think about it later. Maybe I'll ask my team, and they click away. The moment you introduce any hesitation in the online sales process, you ask your prospect to, count something, to do some analysis. Small business owners don't have time for this. So that's where the unlimited and very simple pricing is going to drive conversions. That is not going to be the case for enterprise level customers that have teams of procurement whose job is to assess and predict and forecast usage and so on. So that's, I think, often kind of SaaS companies forget that the SMB and online lineup can be and very often should be very different to what we offer to enterprises, and that's particularly for that kind of consumption-based forecasting, budgeting type of decisions.
Yeah. So it sounds like pros and cons for each model, and it really, really depends on, which ones you're looking at for your particular business, size of your customer, and also customer experience in terms of engaging that from a predictability standpoint. So credit burn down, from what I've heard from you, it sounds like pros are like level of transparency around consumption and it alleviates that budgeting. But then cons are determinant of adoption, and then usage overage. It's like, yes, you can do that, but then there better be alerts and predictability of, in the short term of how you're going to do that, and visibility in terms of what the overage is. And then pay as you go. It sounds like the cons are it's just super unpredictable for the company. And then, but the pros are it is a good land and expand motion. I think, looking at that, like, Maggie, I wanted to touch back on the usage overage component of, if it's time limited, how do you think about structuring that out in terms of pricing? And it sounds like it's more of an upmarket strategy.
Yeah, well, one thing, going back to your comment around kind of add-ons and the ability to sell with a little bit more flexibility. So important that, let's say you are asking for an upfront commit and there is an overage model, you have the ability to sell more capacity in the middle of a contract term should they kind of blow through what they've purchased. And so often what we see is customers who are adopting like crazy and finding value in our product, they'll go over a purchase amount, and rather than just having them go deep in the red on overages, we can sell more capacity in the middle of the contract and just sort of get them on a plan, a subscription model that is more fit for their usage needs. And so I'd say we try to course correct as soon as possible so they're not hitting overages, because that's a poor experience for them and frankly for us as well. Or even when we see early renewals. So kind of just let's do a whole reset and right size the subscription. And that also leads me into kind of a segue of volume discounting. So, right, as you buy more, we can give you beneficial pricing in the form of a volume discount, in sort of a way to incentivize to adopt, to use, right? So your price per unit can go down with the more you use and buy.
Nice. Yeah. Speaking of discounts, Jan, I wanted to touch a little bit on that as well. In terms of discounting, how do you think about sort of, monthly versus annual contracts, or, how do you incentivize discounts, maybe with a declining term-based discount? What are some favorites there, things that you think are particularly effective for discounting strategies for reps?
I'm going to repeat this throughout our conversation, because again, it's all depends on what we are trying to accomplish, right? Usually, what the needs of the business are is growing the size of the deal, because that way we can kind of drive more revenue within kind of the same body of sales reps. So that is about volume discounting. There are a few ways to execute volume discounting, but then usually just selecting the right volume discounting method and adjusting how aggressive it's going to be that should stimulate growth of deal size. There is also another need to drive longer term contracts because it drives stickiness. And that one is interesting because I think everybody just defaults to the monthly annual set of pricing. Usually the monthly is about 15 to 25% more expensive than annual. And that's fine. But then sometimes it is possible that we are still going to, if we are confident that customers are staying with us long term, giving them the annual discount is unnecessary. So still maintaining the monthly flexibility for a very sticky product can be the right solution from a yield management, because the customers, sometimes the customers who commit to annual contract are the ones who already kind of self-select because they know they're going to use the solution for years to come because they've integrated it with their internal processes. And in a way, they are getting a discount for something they would have done anyway without the discount. So that's where digging into the behaviors and churn patterns is important before we decide on the monthly versus annual. But that's usually a great tool to drive stickiness. And yeah, apart from that, there is the adjustment for a willingness to pay and kind of adjustment for a use case and an industry that the particular customer is in, because we know that, let's say, customers in finance are less price sensitive because of their use case than customers in retail, for example. And it can be solved through two ways. One is actually setting different price points for different industries. Like, many SaaS companies have different government rate cards or different real estate or finance rate cards or offerings, or just giving the reps the ability to adjust the price on the fly as they are talking to the customer. With the right level of guidance and the right level of approvals and educating sales, I think that the latter is kind of more effective than overly kind of structuring and complicating the portfolio.
So you think like one-on-one reps kind of determining what's best for their customer within reason, within constraint is actually a pretty good pot. Like
it is. It is, as long as they have access to the data on what are the similar deals closing for this type of situation, because very often they don't know, and the only source of information they have is water cooler chats with their peers. But then sometimes bad practices are spreading that way, and some over discounting propagates across the organization because there is no this element of pricing operations or a deal desk, and so a team like ours can provide the data. I know that sales reps are the ones who know the customer the best, but then we can bring the context of what other customers and other proposals were successful from a kind of data and education perspective.
That totally makes sense. And that makes me think about the next question, which is really about tooling so that you have access to the data. One of the things I think is really interesting is a lot of companies bring in pricing experts, and you get a glorified spreadsheet of pricing, of this beautiful heaven of pricing, and then you're left to operationalize it and figure out how to get it into the hands of your reps in a quoting tool in Salesforce. And, that's mostly why we actually started our company, is to be able to realize any pricing you can dream of and then change it on the fly. But, not to talk about us, but what has been your experience in terms of leveraging traditional, CPQ and billing, which I think oftentimes kind of premeditate that they think that, pricing is never going to change. They weren't built for agility, which is, I think, what modern business requires now is everything you've said on this call, A/B testing, being able to segment different parts of the platform on the fly. They're kind of the antithesis of that. So would love for you to, you may be jaded by this, talk about, the hindrance of traditional systems to your job and really your wish list of what you want and what you need to get out of a system.
That is true what you mentioned, that very often pricing structure that was designed at the beginning of the product journey, at some early stages of the product development or a company development, is assumed that we are going to price the same way forever. And a lot of the tools, billing, quoting, is built with the restrictions without allowing for some significant changes. And as we observe, especially right now, when the reality of 2021, the pandemic markets were drastically different to what we see in 2023, and relatively fast adjustment of pricing models because of the changing markets is crucial, and very often the infrastructure is hindering us. I know that Maggie is planning some big changes, so she is there's a very broad and very deep kind of execution process that she is going through to make it happen.
Right. I think one thing that we always come up against is the strategy is bound by the system. And that is always kind of the worst case, right? You have this grand idea, everyone says, awesome, go execute. And then you realize you can't really do it in a scalable way. And it gets to the point where the strategy and the goals for growth are pushing beyond the constraints of your tech stack, and then you're forced into manual steps, which are both vulnerable to errors, but also costly because it requires, human capital to do it. And so we're kind of seeing that in our own experience, where we're wanting to try more things like multi-product bundles, different tests in international versus North America, different tests for new customers versus install base, and having the ability to be more agile is all seen as a big, yes, let's do it, but it requires systems investment. And so wholeheartedly believe that if you're set up for a more flexible and agile CPQ billing tech stack, it will allow you to be more nimble in the way you price and package and go to market with your products.
Yeah, it's funny because I was thinking about, Jan, you just said, hey, I want to give my reps flexibility. But then in my head, I've heard so many horror stories. The rep went and did some unique quote that landed a great deal. And then it takes companies 2 weeks to actually break their order form to actually get the quote out the door. And that's kind of insane to me at this point in, SaaS evolution, is that we should be able to spin out those A/B testing that you were talking about. You should be able to segment. You should have the data transactionally from CPQ to billing to know where the insights are across that whole spectrum, where you can gain back revenue or you can actually, toggle a little bit more. But Jan, do you have anything to add to what Maggie was saying in terms of what she's saying?
Yeah, it is a very common occurrence that a large customer wants to buy in a particular way because that fits their processes and purchasing operational requirements, and we are not able to fulfill it because of the system limitations. So then we apply some workarounds that Maggie mentioned are very operationally expensive. So we can do it for large customers, but then what if our pricing was flexible enough that we can do it for smaller customers without such a big operational cost? That would definitely bring, result in the growth of top line. So that the flexibility is particularly important, with some education and guidelines of how it should be utilized. I do believe that when reps have the right incentives and the right data to make the decisions, then they would do the right thing for the customer and for the SaaS provider.
Love that. Well, we have only a couple minutes left, and I like to do a little "what did I miss" at the end of the podcast. Is there something you want to say to listeners about pricing that I didn't hit on? Just really quick, like top little soundbite of things you want to add on. Maybe starting with you, Maggie, first. Is there anything left? And you can totally say no.
Yeah, so I think one of the initial conversations we had was how to use data to inform your pricing. And I think that Jan and I were discussing it's really kind of three pillars that create this sort of triangulation we always want to use. And so external data being sort of market and competitive data. Second, internal, so transactional data, looking at what was sold in the past, trends around that, how much are we discounting, the volume, and then also usage data. And then the third is what are we hearing from our customers and prospects? And often we can perform research to do that, sort of a quantitative study to inform willingness to pay. Or also, sales can be a great channel into what's on top of mind for our customers. And so always when we're thinking about pricing and packaging, we want to use those three components of data to help us get to the best solution.
And that's a very good point, Maggie. Thank you. I think that kind of the one line that I want to leave everybody with is the pricing strategy and arrangements have to be considered in a context of the goals of the product and of the company, and following certain solutions just because the competition is applying them is not always the right idea. So it requires a little bit more digging than that.
I love both of your wisdom at the end there. And it almost could be another hour of conversation on both those topics. So we may just have to have you back for part 2. But thank you both so much for spending the time with me. And I'm sure that, people listening will have many questions, and hopefully we can do this again sometime. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Kate.